One of the ways we love to talk about being a parent is around this language of phases, and that's intentional use of language because there are often moments where we are reminding ourselves it's just a phase. It's just a phase, eventually they'll sleep through the night, or it's just a phase, eventually they'll get out of this style. It's just a phase, eventually they'll make their own breakfast, or they'll get dressed themselves. It's just a phase, eventually I won't have to drive to everything. Whatever it might be, this saying that we use as a reality, it's just a phase, but that also means that as phases pass, so does the stage our kids are in. Our kids change. Every 52 weeks, our kids enter a new phase, which means we need to relearn our kids. It means the conversations we had last year change and they adapt and they grow. A phase is a time frame in a kid's life when we have unique opportunities to influence them. In each phase, that opportunity changes a little bit. The times that work best change. The way we ask the questions change. The people who are most important to them change. The phases change. And because things change, we believe that there are certain conversations that should happen in every phase. Phases that happen year after year. Things like sexual integrity that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Things like technological responsibility in a highly connected world. We also believe one of those important yearly conversations is the subject of race. There's a common myth, especially amongst non-minority people, which is obviously the experience I bring into a conversation like this. But one of those myths is that it's better to not talk about race or racism. In 2006, there was a children's research lab at the University of Texas, and a doctoral student by the name of Birgit Wittrup. She wanted to explore more about the questions of race and the understanding that kids have when it comes to the way they perceive people who just don't look like them. She asked hundreds of 5 to 7-year-old white kids about their perception of black and brown other people, other races. And so she tested them about their perceptions and divided them into different groups. One of the groups was given multiculturally themed videos to watch as a family in their home to watch over the course of a week. Videos that didn't directly talk about race or racism, but they at least presented a picture of multicultural friendship. The second group added to the videos explicit conversations about race. So not only watched the video, but families were given specific questions and conversation prompts about race and interracial friendships. The third group wasn't given a checklist of they were given a checklist of racial topics, but no videos. They weren't given specific questions, but were just generally encouraged to talk about racial equality, but didn't have any tools. 5 families immediately dropped out of the study, 2 even pointing out, we don't want to point out skin color. Now this is important because it's one thing if they were jumping into a research project that they didn't really know anything about, but they signed up knowing this was a study about children's racial attitudes. As Wittrup researched, what she learned is that for most of the families, they did not generally talk to their kids about things like race. And so maybe they'd say something like everybody's equal or God made all of us, but they would never point out racial differences. They wanted their children to grow up colorblind. Now here's the problem. When she did her research and asked questions like how many white people are mean, the children answered almost none. But then when they were asked how many black people were mean, the answer changed to some or to a lot. When kids were asked if their parents were friends with black people, that more than half of the kids answered, I don't know, or no. And so she began to look at the research and crunch the numbers and the studies and find out what was happening. What was really frustrating, though, for her is that when she looked at the differences between the groups, she didn't really see any major change in attitudes. Which is initially surprising. You'd think that one group that had the videos would respond differently than the group that had the conversation prompts, which would respond differently than the ones that didn't have anything. Like if they were having intentional conversations and resources, you'd expect a difference. But when Wittrup went back to dig into why the data didn't show what she was expecting, what she found out is in them describing the process, only 6 families out of the hundreds of families, only 6 families actually had a conversation about race. And so they got the videos, they just didn't talk about it. They got the conversation prompts, but they just didn't actually have the conversation. And so when they looked at the numbers, every single one of those families they had improved racial attitudes. See, what she discovered was that for non-minority families, the myth that it's better to not talk about race was so cemented in that even when given prompts and suggestions, they just couldn't do it. So maybe for you, think about like an opportunity to point out race to your kids. And so especially if you're a non-minority, think about like when a president like Obama became president, would that be something you highlight to your kids? Or maybe somebody like Kamala Harris pointing out her gender or her skin color as she becomes vice president. Is that something you would point out to your kids or not? Because for many of us, we believe that, it's better not to point those things out and just believe that our kids will figure it out. Current research suggests that as early as 6 months old, kids begin to recognize race. Not only that, what I think is interesting about that is we have no problem teaching and quizzing our kids about colors, teaching them about what color is blue, what color is black, what color is green. But then when it comes to the colors of our skins, we wouldn't point that out. And so we point out the color of somebody's hair, but we don't point out the color of somebody's skin. Why would we do that? Especially if that is an important part of a person. If there's nothing wrong with a difference in color, why wouldn't we point it out? See, kids developmentally categorize everything: food, toys, clothes. The same is true with skin color. Whether you even realize they do it or not, kids learn to look at people and say, who looks like me? And so one day a kid might look at a kid and he's wearing a blue shirt. And if they're both wearing blue shirts, then that kid's like me. And they will also do the same thing with skin color. That kid has dark skin, I have dark skin. So, that kid looks like me and he must like the things I like. He must be just like me. Kids tend to most like those who resemble themselves. Another common misconception is what we call the diverse environment theory. In essence, it believes that if we just put people into diverse environments, talking about it isn't really necessary. Like, just put our kids and expose them to diversity, put them in the public school, and they'll be exposed to multiple cultures and different environments, and they will figure it out. They won't have prejudice. They won't have the racist attitudes they have to deal with. They will just not do what has been done throughout history. And here's the thing. I believe diverse environments are important. I think that's something we should work on and encourage, but it's not enough. To fight against racism, it requires learning about history, the messy and sinful racial history in our own country. It requires dealing with our own struggles and prejudices and past choices. It requires being honest about friends and racial tensions. It requires being honest about advantages and disadvantages. It requires realizing that there are conversations that I don't have to have with my kids when they one day are pulled over that other dads have to have. The reason diverse environment theory itself doesn't work is because increased opportunity for interaction, apart from quality conversations, doesn't improve interracial relationships. In fact, what the research is showing is that for a high school student, only about 8% of white high schoolers would have a black best friend, and it's slightly higher for a black high schooler. So what do we do about that? Because just being in the environment where people are around each other doesn't actually mean that people are learning to have healthy relationships, to work through sin and prejudice and racism. And so what we believe is that having the conversation is important. And the best place to have that conversation is in your home. And so we've tried to put together guides and resources. This is why we're making the video, because our goal is to give you language to use and language to avoid, to give you resources and tools, books that you can read as a family or videos that you can watch. And so I want to work through how we are thinking about some of this in order to help you along the way. And here's why this is important. As followers of Jesus, it's the message of Jesus that has been the reason culture moves towards equality. It was the message of Jesus that shaped Martin Luther King Jr. as he would march and as he would protest and as he would fight against inequality. And I believe the same thing is true today. The racial conversation, while it wants to be hijacked into a battle between progressive and conservative, it has nothing to do with that. It's a conversation that's meant to be led by the people of God, and a conversation that you as a parent have the opportunity to lead. When Jesus in Matthew 7, verse 12 says, do to others what you would want them to do to you. Or in Hebrews, when the author says, remember also those who are being mistreated as if you felt the pain in your own bodies. How might those texts shape the way that we think about how we talk to our kids. What we're using as a definition for racism when we talk to our kids, whether it be preschool kids or elementary or high school, racism means treating someone badly because of the color of their skin. There's an incredible book, a kid's book about racism, which is a great tool and resource to think about how to define this. But here's the thing, talking about racism for a preschooler is different than it is for your 8-year-old, which is different than it is for your middle schooler or for your high schooler, which is why we have variations of guides and ideas of things to say or things not to say, because what you should say to your preschooler is not the same thing you should say to your high schooler. And so here's how we want you to think about it. For preschoolers, we want to show your kids the different ways God has made people, so they will celebrate the beauty in all of God's children. This includes pointing out differences in skin colors. If you can point out the colors of eyes or hair, you can point out the color of someone's skin. This is good, this is helpful. Multicultural toys can be great tools for this, to point out the color of the Barbie. To read a book that includes multiple races, a book like When God Made You, to point out the different colors of skin that you see as you read the stories on the pages. I think what I realized in this conversation is that initially what I thought was the way to respond to this was not. Initially, I thought that as a white person, that if my kids noticed another person's skin color, I should say, shh, don't say that, don't talk about it. But what I've been convicted is if God created all the colors beautiful, when one of my kids noticed somebody with black or brown skin and points that out, I should encourage that. How incredible is it? How beautiful is it the way that God has made us different? For elementary, we want to discuss differences amongst different groups of people so they will desire fairness and see beauty in all of God's children. And so in elementary, we begin to have an opportunity for a couple of key ideas here. One's discussion. There's a little bit more conversation about it. Your kids might have more awareness of things going on in culture. They might notice a protest. You might even take them to a protest. They might hear classmates talking about something. They will probably also have feelings that arise out of that, feelings that you can validate, feelings that you can talk about. They're also old enough to talk about history of racism, conversations about slavery and voting and segregation and violence. All of these are age-appropriate ways to talk to an elementary student. And the other thing that an elementary student can understand really, really well is fairness. Right? How many of our kids will quickly jump in to point out when something's not fair? If you want to teach your kids about justice, the word fair is a perfect avenue into that conversation. For middle schoolers, we want to help them understand how different groups of people have been treated differently so that they will begin to empathize. In middle school, we want to move from just discussing to understanding. We want a middle schooler to begin to think of what does that person feel. For a middle schooler, you could say something like, I wonder how black people feel when they hear a story like that. See, for a middle schooler, this kind of thinking is new developmentally, but when you help them do that, it is really impactful to begin to put themselves in another person's shoes. You should also ask your middle schooler, what have you heard? Because whether or not you like it, they are being informed by the conversations they're having with their friends, the conversations that they are having online. And so ask them, what have you heard and how do you feel about what you've heard? For high schoolers, we want to encourage a passion for what is right, so they will stand up for people who are mistreated. In high school, we want to begin to raise the kind of kids that want to do something about injustice. And so they move from empathizing as a middle schooler to doing something as a high schooler. And keep in mind, they might want to do something and it might not be the way you would do it. See, one of the coolest things, regardless of how you feel about the politics or the history of things like protests, is that they're often led by teenagers. Even this past year, the protests that happened in our own area were started by high schoolers. Historically, when Martin Luther King led marches, it was often teenagers who were at the forefront. Now with your high schooler, the conversations get harder. They get a little bit messier. They don't just think like you do. They're not just going to believe the same things you believe. Their questions will get a little bit harder, a little bit more complicated. There will begin to be a little bit more nuance to it. You might also experience questions that you don't have the answers for, and you don't have to respond to everything. But there's also an incredible moment and an opportunity to fuel passions, to help our kids become the kind of people that want to take their relationship with Jesus to then fight for other people. And so we realize all of this is important. And so this is why we've created guides that you can download online, guides that will help you have things that, all right, here are some things you can say, here are some things not to say, because we believe that there are some helpful things to think about and to say and discuss, conversation pieces, but also things that we should say that we maybe don't automatically think to say, and things we shouldn't say that we don't realize aren't actually helpful. And this, for us, is not something that's driven by politics. While there are plenty of not helpful political arguments and phrases, this is really all about being a follower of Jesus. And we believe that your kids are forming opinions and having conversations. And we think that you should be leading those conversations and that the church should be partnering with you to have them. And we might not always get this conversation right. We might not always feel comfortable having this conversation, and depending on your background, this might not even be a conversation you're used to. Again, I'm speaking from the perspective of a white dad talking to my kids about race. This is not something I grew up talking about. I'm not even used to having those conversations. But I believe if there's going to be a generation that does this differently, a generation that wants racial reconciliation, we need to have the conversation. To not expect that they'll just figure it out if we just put them in the right environment. To not expect by just being exposed to something that they will actually change how they think and treat other people. So we need to have the conversations. Because what I do know is our kids need to have this conversation. And the best way for things to begin to look differently in our world is by having this conversation and raising a generation who treats others the way that Jesus treats others.